Coming after the Appassionata with its unremitting darkness is one of the most luminous pieces which Beethoven has ever written, the Sonata in F sharp major number 24. Together with the Sonata number 25 and the Fantasy opus 77, it was commissioned by the London-based publisher Muzio Clementi, pianist previously and composer and later turned publisher. Clementi was trying for ages to get Beethoven to publish something with his house, unsuccessfully until he went to Vienna and met Beethoven in 1807, and then he negotiated not only to publish a large pile of Beethoven's manuscripts in London, but also he commissioned Beethoven to write 2 new sonatas and a fantasy at an unspecified time and at his leisure. That is to say, without time constraints. So this was negotiated in 1807, and in 1809 Beethoven finally found the leisure to write these sonatas, and number 24 and number 25, opus 78 and 79, together with the fantasy opus 77, were the results of this collaboration. This sonata, with its nickname A Thérèse, was dedicated to the Countess Teresa van Brunswick. Beethoven had close ties to the Brunswick family. Her brother, Franz, was a close friend and was the dedicatee both of the Appassionata and in this little group of works of the Fantasy, opus 77. Teresa was the dedicatee of this sonata, number 24, and Josephine, not a dedicatee of any of these works, but one of the main candidates of the immortal beloved of Beethoven's letters. We still do not know for sure whom he meant, but it is a strong possibility that Josephine was indeed the one. And in any case, between 1804 and 1810, he wrote to Josephine no less than 10 letters, calling her, among other things, my angel, my everything, and my only love. But this is an aside. This sonata has nothing to do with Josephine, but with Teresa. Teresa was a former student, piano student of Beethoven's. And it is interesting that between the 2 sonatas, number 24 and 25, he chose to dedicate this to Teresa and not the other. And the reason it is somewhat unusual is that Teresa, according to all accounts, was quite a mediocre pianist, particularly in terms of technical ability, and this sonata is unusually uncomfortable, partially based on the key in which it is written. F sharp major not only is an unusual key in its color, and actually it is the only work that Beethoven has ever written in this key, but also very simple passages, once transposed to F sharp major, all of a sudden become quite uncomfortable because the keys, the black keys, happen to make the fingers stumble. But in any case, perhaps the reason he dedicated the sonata to her was nothing to do with her ability as a pianist, but rather with the poetic imagery he conceived in the sonata, and perhaps he associated those images with her. It starts with a 4-bar phrase, which is unique in that it is an introduction which is not repeated and not developed in any way within the sonata. Beethoven usually, if he introduces an idea, he then reworks it, he reuses it, he uses it as cells, musical cells, which he then can apply to other bits of the sonata, but not here. Here the phrase stands on its own, effectively an introduction, but it carries so much weight, so much poetic beauty for these 4 bars that it is very special. For me, there is a sense of being in the presence of something so pure and majestic that we're almost awestruck. There is a sense of great depth coming from these F sharp octaves, almost the lowest notes which Beethoven had at the keyboard. And above these repeated octaves, the right hand rises up. pure and beautiful and almost hymn-like. I find this one of the most beautiful moments of Beethoven in any kind of composition. And interestingly, he never comes back to that. It occurs just once at the beginning. It brings us this sense of and then it is gone. But it ushers in the loveliest and most poetic of first movements. It is singing, it is beautiful, it comes from the heart. It seems very simple in its language, but it is simplicity which touches us very, very deeply. F sharp major, a key with 6 sharps. Beethoven usually, if he writes in unusual keys, tends to go towards the flats. He uses keys like A flat minor, with 7 flats. He writes movements in E flat minor with 6 flats. So it tends to go towards the deeper part of the unusual spectrum of keys. But sharps, they bring with themselves a sense of striving upwards, of something that rises. This is not just in Beethoven. If you think just for a moment, the 4th sonata by Scriabin, this feeling of transparency which actually relates to Beethoven music and this sense of something which is being lifted up. So this is an element which is throughout the sonata played upon. Beethoven puts a lot of the music quite high in the keyboard. This feeling of being really as close to the edge as he could. But this is not just crystalline, weightless, floating. The music is suffused with warmth throughout. It is also unusual in 2 questions of form. One is that it is in 2 movements only, and it is a form which Beethoven started to explore a little bit for the drawer in the 2 little sonatas, opus 49, but then for publication in the F major sonata number 22. Then here in sonata 24, then with even more poetry in sonata number 27, and then perhaps most beautifully of all in the sonata number 32 with its transcended 2nd movement. It is a very compact form, and Beethoven usually writes 2 contrasting movements. Like here, the first movement is lyrical and beautiful, an outpouring of sincere emotions. The 2nd movement, as we'll see, is irreverent and bouncy and jumpy and everything which the first movement is not. But apart from that, another unusual occurrence is that in a sonata form, in early sonatas, in sonatas by Haydn, some sonatas by Mozart, there were 2 repeats. The exposition was played and then repeated. Then we would play the development and reprise and repeat the development and reprise. Beethoven does that also in the first 2 of his sonatas, but after that he abandons this idea because his developments become so big and the reprise then becomes also so weighty, and usually he adds a coda, which is yet another section. So to go after that back to the beginning of the development feels wrong. We have passed too much, and therefore he abandons this 2nd repeat. The exposition is often repeated, not always, but often. But the 2nd repeat disappears. But here, and also in Sonata 25, the 2nd sonata he wrote for Muzio Clementi, he asks the pianist also to repeat the 2nd half of the exposition. And here there are 2 interesting differences, an interesting difference between the 2 sonatas. In sonata number 25, he writes exposition, repeat, development, reprise, repeat, and then coda. So the coda comes as a closure after everything has already been played twice. But here in Sonata number 24, the coda is included in the reprise and is repeated twice, therefore. So after the reprise ends, and we have once again this upwards this climax effectively of the entire thing, the second subject comes back, and then we have a long winded coda where the left hand plays passages up and down. Play them slowly here. Definitely not for beginners in terms of the technical difficulty thinking of Teresa van Brunswick. And above that, the right hand participates in quite a passionate dialogue with the left. A bit of the melody. And then it seems to evaporate. Once again, this feeling of being as high as possible. But then it ends loudly. And from here, he goes back to the beginning of the development, then the reprise comes again and the coda is played twice. So the climax appears twice effectively, and this long winded coda as well. Perhaps one of the reasons is that he was in a period of experimentation with form in general. In the previous sonatas, in the Appassionata for example, the finale, there he omits the repeat of the first half of the exposition, but then he insists on repeating the second and third, that is the development and the reprise, and then he writes a coda. He does the same thing in sonata number 22, and here perhaps he was trying to incorporate the coda inside the repeat. And also one should mention the short length of the sonata. With all the repeats, it is still just over 10 minutes in length. So the entire sonata, with everything repeated, is less than the first movement of the Appassionata, where there are no repeats at all. Not to compare and not to say that the length matters, but perhaps for Beethoven, who had an exquisite sense of proportions inside the movements and also of the movements inside works, the question of what to repeat and how long should the general effect of the movement be, perhaps that was also a consideration. The finale and the second movement simultaneously is extremely short in comparison. It is just 2 minutes and a half. It starts strikingly on a very dissonant chord, and it is an immediate wake-up call, like snap out of this wonderful reverie that you had in the first movement, and we're gonna have something very different. And as I said, the entire finale is bouncy and jumpy. And after these jumpy phrases, everything else is just a series of fast passages with the hands chasing each other. And then after each episode there comes a loud chord, and then in a real game of cat and mouse, the hands chase each other over the entire keyboard, going up and down, all in the prolongation of the same harmony until he gets back to the... So the first time it appears, it is 10 bars, then 12, and then the final time is a quite extreme 16 bar phrase. I'll play it slowly just to demonstrate how much fun he has with this. So quite smile-raising. It's definitely a joke which he enjoyed and which he enjoyed sharing with us as the audience. Finally, there is a moment of not hesitation but a small pause. And then a loud outburst brings the sonata to a close. you.